You've been trying to change yourself for years. New habits, new routines, more discipline, and somehow the same reactions keep coming back. In this video, you will learn the Stoic habit that trains the half-second before you react. Not your behavior, you can force that. Not your words, you can edit those. What stays the same is something underneath. A reflex, a pull. The part of you that responds before you even decide to respond. Here is the uncomfortable truth. You cannot change your mind by managing your actions. You can only change your actions after you've changed your mind. The Stoics knew this over 2,000 years ago, not as theory, but as daily practice. Epictetus taught one thing above everything else. The quality of your life is determined not by what happens to you, but by what happens inside you, in the fraction of a second before you react. He had a specific practice for training exactly that moment. A pause, a deliberate pause between the impression and your reaction. It looks too simple to matter. When you hear it described, it sounds like something you already do, but you don't. Almost no one does. Not deliberately, not consistently, not in the way that actually changes anything. Most people spend years trying to fix their reactions by controlling their circumstances. They eliminate triggers, they avoid difficult people, they restructure their environment. And the moment something unexpected breaks through, one conversation, one piece of bad news, one look that landed wrong, everything collapses back to the same place it always was. Because the problem was never the circumstances. The problem is what happens inside you in the half-second before you can even choose to respond. That is where your character either holds or breaks. That is where years of effort either compound or evaporate. Modern neuroscience can now show in physical terms what this Stoic practice does to the brain. It is not a metaphor. It is not motivation. It is measurable, structural change in the circuits that govern your impulses, your attention, and your ability to think clearly when everything in you wants to react. By the end of this video, you will know what this habit is, why it produces real neurological change, and why its simplicity is the exact reason most people dismiss it before it ever gets the chance to work. But to understand the solution, you first need to understand what is actually breaking down inside you, and why no amount of effort has ever been enough to stop it. Every time something happens to you, a harsh word, an unexpected problem, a moment of frustration, your brain does something before you do. It generates an impression, not a thought, not a decision, a raw, automatic signal that arrives fully formed and already loaded with emotion and urgency. In a fraction of a second, your brain has already decided what this moment means, how threatening it is, and what you should do about it. The Stoics called this a fantasia, an impression of reality, not reality itself. Epictetus made a distinction that almost everyone misses. The impression is not the problem. The impression is inevitable. Your brain will always generate one. What is not inevitable is what you do with it. Between the impression and your response, there is a gap. And everything, your character, your clarity, your freedom, lives inside that gap. Epictetus said it plainly. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. Not the event, the impression you form about it. That is what controls you, until you learn to examine it. Here is where neuroscience makes this concrete. When something emotionally charged happens, the part of your brain called the amygdala, the structure that functions as your internal alarm system, fires immediately. It doesn't wait for context. It doesn't ask questions. It sends a signal to your body before the conscious part of your mind even knows what's happening. This is why you say things you regret. This is why you react in ways that directly contradict your own values. This is not weakness. This is architecture. Your brain was built to respond fast because for most of human history, speed was survival.
The problem is that most of what triggers your amygdala today is not a predator. It is an email, a comment, a tone of voice that felt dismissive, a silence that lasted slightly too long. And your brain treats all of it with the same urgency it would treat a physical threat. The same chemicals, the same narrowing of attention, the same impulse to act before thinking, so you react. And after you react, you justify. You construct a narrative around the reaction to make it seem like a choice, but it wasn't a choice. It was a reflex wearing the mask of a decision. The Stoic habit doesn't ask you to suppress the impression. It doesn't ask you to pretend the reaction isn't there. It asks you to see it clearly, deliberately, before you give it permission to become your behavior. That moment of seeing is where the rewiring begins. But there is one specific mechanism in the mind that makes this nearly impossible for most people, and it is the mechanism no one talks about. When nothing urgent demands your attention, your brain doesn't rest. It starts wandering, replaying the past, anticipating the future, constructing narratives about who you are and what might go wrong. The same patterns, the same fears, running on repeat beneath the surface of your day. Most people live almost entirely inside this mode, not because they're disciplined, because no one taught them to exit it. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal, not for publication, not for posterity, but for himself, that the mind becomes what it repeatedly attends to. Every morning, before the demands of an empire arrived, he practiced one thing: noticing where his attention had drifted and pulling it back deliberately. That is not willpower. It is something more precise, the act of stepping outside the automatic current of your own mind and observing it, even briefly, before it pulls you back under. When you do this consistently, something measurable happens in the brain. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for judgment and the ability to pause before acting, becomes more active. The automatic patterns lose their grip, not permanently, not in one attempt, but with repetition, the balance shifts. The Stoics called this prosoche, attention to self, not self-obsession, deliberate, calm observation of what is happening inside you without immediately becoming it. You cannot interrupt what you cannot see, and you cannot see what you've never been trained to observe. That training begins smaller than you think and compounds faster than you expect. Understanding a principle and embodying it are two completely different things. You can read every word Epictetus ever wrote. You can explain the dichotomy of control with precision, and your mind can still run on the same automatic patterns, because knowledge stored in language is not the same as knowledge stored in behavior. The Stoics were not interested in philosophical literacy. They were interested in philosophical transformation, and the only path to that transformation is repetition of the actual behavior, in real moments with real stakes, imperfectly, again and again. Think of it like physical training. You cannot build strength by reading about lifting. The muscle only changes when you actually lift. The mind works the same way. The examination of impressions, practiced in small, ordinary moments, builds the capacity to examine impressions when everything is on the line. Every repetition is a vote for the person your brain is becoming. We started with one question: why does the behavior keep returning no matter how much effort you apply? The answer is this: you cannot change behavior at the level of behavior. You have to go deeper to the impression, to the gap, to the fraction of a second before you become the reaction. That gap is where your character lives, and it can be trained. Marcus Aurelius trained his every morning, imperfectly, consistently, not because he was extraordinary, because he never stopped. Write in the comments one word that describes who you are becoming through this practice, not who you are building. One word. Name it. If this gave you a different way of understanding your own mind, subscribe to this channel. Every video here is built on the same foundation: Stoic depth, neuroscience clarity, and zero shortcuts. The work is quiet, the results are not.